The bustling courthouse in downtown Chicago hummed with its usual morning activity. People shuffled through security checkpoints, lawyers hurried past with briefcases in hand, and the echo of footsteps bounced off the marble floors. But this particular Wednesday morning in 2019 would prove to be anything but ordinary. In courtroom 304, a young man in his early 20s stood before Judge Richard Henderson, his shoulders squared despite the weight of the moment. The young man's perfectly tailored navy suit seemed at odds with the judge's preconceptions, who had grown accustomed to seeing young black defendants dressed far more casually in his courtroom. "You seem rather overdressed for this hearing," Judge Henderson remarked with a dismissive wave of his hand, not bothering to hide the condescension in his voice. The comment drew a few snickers from the gallery, but the young man remained composed, his expression neutral. The case before them was a civil rights violation lawsuit against a prominent real estate development company. The young man had filed it on behalf of a community organization, challenging discriminatory housing practices. But Judge Henderson hadn't bothered to read the case file thoroughly, assuming it would be yet another frivolous lawsuit cluttering his docket. "Your Honor," the young man began, his voice clear and steady, "I believe appropriate attire shows respect for the court and the serious nature of these proceedings." His response was measured, professional, and carried an underlying confidence that made Judge Henderson pause. The judge leaned forward, peering over his reading glasses. "And who exactly are you to lecture me about court proceedings? I don't recognize you from my courtroom." The judge's tone dripped with sarcasm, clearly expecting to put this young man in his place. The gallery watched in tense silence as the young man reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card, approaching the bench with permission from the court officer. "My name is Anthony Richardson, Your Honor. I'm a graduate of Yale Law School, first in my class, and currently an associate at Morrison & Bennett. I'm representing the South Side Community Alliance in this matter." The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees as Judge Henderson examined the business card. His face, previously painted with dismissive amusement, slowly transformed as he realized his grave error in judgment. Anthony Richardson wasn't a defendant, he was the plaintiff's attorney. The whispers in the gallery grew louder as people began to recognize the name. Anthony Richardson had made headlines just months earlier for turning down offers from several top law firms in New York and Los Angeles, choosing instead to work at a Chicago firm known for its civil rights advocacy. He had earned his undergraduate degree at 16 and completed law school by 21, all while mentoring underprivileged youth from his old neighborhood. Judge Henderson's complexion reddened as he shuffled through the case files with newfound interest. The detailed briefs, meticulously researched precedents, and compelling arguments that he had barely skimmed earlier now demanded his full attention. The young lawyer he had so quickly dismissed had prepared a case that would be difficult to ignore. "Well, Mr. Richardson," the judge cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure, "proceed with your opening statement." The words came out strained, a stark contrast to his earlier condescending tone. Anthony adjusted his tie and turned to face the gallery. His opening statement would soon remind everyone present why he had earned his reputation as a rising star in Chicago's legal community. But more importantly, this moment would become a powerful reminder about the danger of assumptions and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their age or appearance. The next few hours would prove to be a masterclass in legal argumentation, as Anthony methodically presented evidence of systematic housing discrimination, weaving together statistics, personal testimonies, and legal precedents into an airtight case. With each passing minute, Judge Henderson's earlier behavior seemed increasingly shameful, a fact not lost on anyone present in courtroom 304. As Anthony Richardson presented his case, the atmosphere in courtroom 304 grew increasingly charged with each passing moment. His first piece of evidence was a series of emails between executives at the development company, revealed through discovery, showing a deliberate pattern of rejecting qualified applicants from certain neighborhoods. "Your Honor," Anthony's voice carried throughout the courtroom, these communications clearly demonstrate a systematic effort to maintain what they called neighborhood character, a thinly veiled code for discrimination. He proceeded to display the emails on the courtroom's projection screen, his preparation evident in the methodical way he had organized the evidence. Judge Henderson, now sitting up straight and fully engaged, couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between his initial prejudgment and the brilliant legal mind standing before him. The young lawyer's command of both facts and law was impressive, but it was his ability to weave them into a compelling narrative that truly set him apart. The defense attorney, a senior partner from an expensive downtown firm, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had clearly underestimated his opponent, expecting an inexperienced lawyer he could easily outmaneuver. Instead, he found himself facing someone who had thoroughly outprepared him. During a brief recess, whispers circulated through the courthouse hallways about the morning's events. Several young interns from other courtrooms had slipped in to watch Anthony in action, having heard about the judge's earlier confrontation. Among them was a court clerk who had grown up in the same South Side neighborhood that Anthony was fighting to protect. When proceedings resumed, Anthony called his first witness, Mrs. Chen, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the community for over 40 years. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of how the neighborhood had changed and the impact of the development company's discriminatory practices on families who had called this area home for generations. "They told me my application was incomplete," Mrs. Chen testified, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. "When I submitted the missing document they claimed they needed, they said the unit had already been rented. But my neighbor's daughter saw it advertised online 2 weeks later, at a higher price." Anthony handled her testimony with gentle expertise, drawing out the important details while maintaining the human element of her story. The judge, who had presided over countless discrimination cases before, found himself particularly moved by the authenticity of her account. The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to paint Mrs. Chen's experience as an isolated incident, but Anthony had prepared his witness well. She remained composed, her responses clear and consistent. More importantly, her story was just one piece of a larger puzzle that Anthony was methodically assembling before the court. During the lunch recess, Judge Henderson retreated to his chambers, declining his usual lunch invitation from fellow judges. He found himself replaying his morning interaction with Anthony, feeling a deep sense of shame at how quickly he had jumped to conclusions. The young lawyer's professional response to his inappropriate remarks only magnified his embarrassment. As the afternoon session began, Anthony introduced statistical evidence compiled by housing rights organizations. The data showed a clear pattern: applications from certain zip codes were rejected at rates significantly higher than others, even when applicants had similar income levels and credit scores. "Your Honor," Anthony addressed the court, pulling up a series of graphs on the projection screen, "these numbers tell a story that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. When we overlay these rejection rates with demographic data, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore." The defense team's objections grew increasingly desperate as Anthony systematically dismantled their client's facade of fair housing practices. Their main argument, that decisions were based purely on objective financial criteria, crumbled in the face of Anthony's meticulously researched evidence. What made Anthony's presentation particularly compelling was his ability to connect the dry statistics to real human impact. He weaved back and forth between the data and personal testimonies, creating a tapestry that showed both the broad scope of the discrimination and its devastating effects on individual families. The gallery had grown larger as word spread through the courthouse about the compelling case unfolding in courtroom 304. Among the observers were several senior partners from other law firms, who watched with growing respect as this young lawyer demonstrated skills that many attorneys didn't develop until much later in their careers. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Judge Henderson found himself in an unusual position. The case he had nearly dismissed that morning had become one of the most compelling arguments for housing justice he had heard in his 20 years on the bench. More than that, it had forced him to confront his own biases that might have prevented this important case from receiving the attention it deserved. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., Judge Henderson announced, his tone notably different from the condescending one he had used that morning. "Mr. Richardson, I expect you'll be prepared to continue with your next witnesses?" "Yes, Your Honor," Anthony replied with the same professional demeanor he had maintained throughout the day. "We have several community members prepared to testify, as well as an expert witness on housing discrimination patterns in urban development." As the courtroom began to empty, several young law students who had been watching approached Anthony to introduce themselves. His composure, expertise, and dignity in the face of initial prejudice had made a deep impression. In less than a day, he had not only advanced his case but had also become an inspiration to a new generation of lawyers committed to fighting for justice. The second day of the trial began with an unexpected development. Local news vans had gathered outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes reaching into the morning sky. Word had spread about the young lawyer who had stood his ground against judicial prejudice while fighting for housing justice. Inside courtroom 304, Anthony Richardson maintained his composed demeanor despite the increased attention. If anything, the packed gallery only seemed to sharpen his focus. He began the day by calling Dr. Patricia Walker, a housing policy expert with 20 years of experience studying urban development patterns. "Dr. Walker," Anthony began, his voice clear and measured, "could you explain to the court what you discovered when analyzing the defendant's rental application data from the past 5 years?" The expert adjusted her glasses and leaned toward the microphone. "What we found was a clear statistical anomaly. Applications from predominantly minority neighborhoods were rejected at a rate 3 times higher than those from other areas, even when controlling for income, credit scores, and employment history." The defense attorney stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is mere correlation, not causation." "Your Honor," Anthony responded smoothly, "if you'll allow Dr. Walker to continue, she will demonstrate how these patterns differ significantly from random chance or legitimate business factors." Judge Henderson, now listening with rapt attention, nodded. "Objection overruled. Please continue, Dr. Walker." As the expert testimony unfolded, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune scribbled furiously in her notebook. The story had evolved beyond a simple housing discrimination case. It had become a powerful narrative about challenging assumptions and fighting for justice against all odds. During the mid-morning break, Anthony stepped into the hallway where he was approached by an elderly gentleman who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. The man introduced himself as Mr. Thompson, a retired civil rights attorney who had fought similar battles in the 1960s. "Son," Mr. Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion, "watching you in there, it reminds me of the fights we fought decades ago. But seeing you handle yourself with such dignity when faced with prejudice, that shows how far we've come, and how far we still have to go." Anthony thanked him respectfully, and as he returned to the courtroom, he carried with him the weight of this historical connection. He wasn't just fighting one case, he was continuing a long tradition of lawyers who had used the law to bend the arc of history toward justice. The defense began their cross-examination of Dr. Walker, attempting to poke holes in her methodology. But Anthony had prepared for this, having spent countless hours with the expert reviewing potential challenges to her analysis. Each attempted challenge only served to highlight the robustness of her research. "And isn't it possible," the defense attorney pressed, "that these rejection patterns simply reflect different application quality levels from different neighborhoods?" "Actually," Dr. Walker replied, "we specifically controlled for all standard qualification metrics. The disparity remains significant even among applicants with identical qualifications. In fact, our analysis showed that highly qualified applicants from certain neighborhoods were rejected more frequently than less qualified applicants from preferred areas." During lunch break, Judge Henderson sat alone in his chambers, reviewing his notes. The evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, but what weighed even heavier on his mind was how his own biases had almost prevented this case from being heard fairly. His morning encounter with Anthony the previous day had become a powerful lesson in checking his presumptions. The afternoon session brought perhaps the most compelling testimony yet. Anthony called Robert Lee, a former employee of the development company who had worked in their applications department. Lee had come forward as a whistleblower after witnessing systematic discrimination firsthand. "We were given unofficial guidelines," Lee testified, his hands clasped tightly together. "Nothing in writing, of course. But we were told to find reasons to reject applications from certain zip codes. If we couldn't find a reason, we were told to delay processing until the applicant gave up or found housing elsewhere." The defense team's objection was immediate and forceful, but Anthony was prepared. He produced a series of internal communications that corroborated Lee's testimony, each document carefully obtained through the discovery process and authenticated. As the day wore on, the gallery watched in growing appreciation as Anthony worked through his evidence methodically, building an increasingly compelling case. Several law professors from local universities had come to observe, some taking notes to share with their students about effective trial advocacy. The defense attorneys, representing one of the city's largest development companies, began to show signs of strain. Their client, sitting at the defense table in an expensive suit, had gone from dismissive to concerned as the evidence mounted against his company. Near the end of the day, an unexpected moment of tension arose when the defense attorney made a subtle jab about Anthony's age and experience level. Before Judge Henderson could intervene, Anthony responded with a level of grace that impressed everyone in the courtroom. "Counsel," he said calmly, "I believe the evidence speaks for itself, regardless of the age or experience of the attorney presenting it. Shall we focus on the facts before us rather than personal characteristics?" The gallery broke into murmured approval, and even Judge Henderson couldn't suppress a small smile. The young lawyer had managed to turn what was meant to be an insult into a powerful reminder of the case's core message about looking past superficial judgments. As the day's proceedings came to a close, the impact of the case was already rippling through the legal community. Law firms that had initially overlooked Anthony due to his age were now taking notice of his exceptional skills and unwavering professionalism. More importantly, his performance was challenging long-held assumptions about what a powerful attorney should look like. By the third day of the trial, Courtroom 304 had become the epicenter of a story that was capturing the city's attention. The morning began with an unexpected twist, and the defense team arrived with a stack of new documents they claimed would vindicate their client. "Your Honor," the lead defense attorney announced, "we have evidence that many of the rejected applications had legitimate disqualifying factors that Mr. Richardson's analysis overlooked." Anthony remained still, his expression unchanged. He had anticipated this move, a common tactic to overwhelm opposing counsel with last-minute information. But his countless hours of preparation were about to pay off. "Your Honor," Anthony rose slowly, "we would remind the court that discovery deadlines passed 6 weeks ago. However, we're prepared to address these documents, because we've already seen them." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Anthony reached into his briefcase. He produced a detailed analysis of the very documents the defense had just presented, complete with highlighted sections showing how they actually supported his case. "These records," Anthony continued, his voice steady, "were buried in the defendant's digital archives, which we obtained during discovery. We've already cross-referenced them with our witness testimonies. In fact, they provide additional evidence of systematic discrimination." Judge Henderson watched with growing admiration as Anthony methodically explained how the defense's supposed smoking gun actually reinforced the pattern of discrimination. The young lawyer's thoroughness was remarkable. He had anticipated and prepared for every potential counterargument. During the morning break, a local housing rights activist approached Anthony in the hallway. "My organization has been fighting these developers for years," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But we never had the resources or legal expertise to prove what we all knew was happening. What you're doing here, it's giving people hope." The activist's words seemed to energize Anthony as he returned to the courtroom. His next witness was a data analyst who had helped compile the statistical evidence. Through careful questioning, Anthony guided the analyst through a presentation that transformed complex data into a clear and compelling story of injustice. If we look at this heat map, the analyst explained, pointing to a color-coded display of the city, we can see how rejection rates create perfect boundaries around certain neighborhoods. The probability of this pattern occurring by chance is less than 1 in 10 million. The defense team's cross-examination grew increasingly aggressive as their case weakened. They attempted to discredit the analyst's credentials, but Anthony's preparation proved invaluable once again. He had thoroughly vetted every witness and documented their qualifications. During the lunch recess, Judge Henderson overheard two veteran lawyers discussing the case in the courthouse cafeteria. "I've never seen anything like it," one said. "The kid's got the skills of a seasoned litigator with none of the cynicism. He's making us all remember why we went to law school in the first place." The afternoon session brought a dramatic moment when Anthony called a surprise witness, a former executive assistant from the development company. She had come forward after reading about the case in the morning news, bringing with her personal notes from meetings where discriminatory policies were openly discussed. "There was a running joke in the office," she testified, her voice quiet but firm. "They called it, maintaining the neighborhood's character. Everyone knew what that meant, but nobody was supposed to say it out loud." The defense team's objection to this last-minute witness was overruled when Anthony demonstrated that he had properly amended his witness list as soon as she had come forward. Judge Henderson noted how the young lawyer had followed every procedural rule meticulously, even while adapting to unexpected developments. As the day progressed, the gallery watched Anthony navigate complex legal arguments with remarkable skill. He wasn't just presenting evidence, he was weaving together a narrative that made the abstract concept of housing discrimination tangible and personal. A powerful moment came when Anthony displayed a series of photos showing the human impact of the development company's policies. Families who had been forced to leave their neighborhoods, community businesses that had closed, and elderly residents who could no longer afford to stay in their homes of decades. "Your Honor," Anthony addressed the court, his passion evident but controlled, "these aren't just statistics we're discussing. These are people's lives. Every rejected application represents a family's dreams being denied, not because of their qualifications, but because of who they are and where they come from." The defense attorney attempted to object to the emotional nature of the presentation, but Judge Henderson overruled it. The young lawyer had carefully balanced emotional impact with solid legal argumentation, staying within the bounds of proper court procedure while making the human stakes clear. Late in the afternoon, an elderly man in the gallery stood up and asked permission to address the court. He identified himself as a retired judge who had presided over housing cases in the 1970s. Judge Henderson made the unusual decision to let him speak briefly. "I've seen countless housing discrimination cases over the decades," the retired judge said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But I've rarely seen one presented with such clarity and purpose. This young man reminds us that the law, when wielded with skill and conviction, can still be a powerful force for justice." As the day drew to a close, the impact of Anthony's case had spread far beyond courtroom 304. Law schools were requesting transcripts of the proceedings for their civil rights law classes. Community organizations were mobilizing to support similar cases in other neighborhoods. And Judge Henderson found himself reflecting deeply on how his initial prejudice had almost prevented this momentous case from being heard. The fourth day of the trial brought an electric atmosphere to courtroom 304. News of the case had spread across social media, and the courthouse steps were crowded with community members holding signs supporting housing justice. Inside, Anthony Richardson prepared for what would be the most challenging day yet. The defense team had brought in a senior partner from their firm's New York office, a legendary litigator known for turning seemingly lost cases around. He sat at the defense table in an immaculate suit, exuding confidence as he prepared to present their key expert witness. "The defense calls Dr. William Barrett," he announced, his voice filling the courtroom. Dr. Barrett was a well-known economist who had testified in numerous housing cases, usually on behalf of large corporations. His testimony had helped defeat similar discrimination claims in other cities. Anthony watched carefully as Dr. Barrett was sworn in. During his preparation for the case, he had spent countless hours studying transcripts of Barrett's previous testimonies, looking for patterns and inconsistencies. Now, that preparation would be put to the test. The defense attorney skillfully led Dr. Barrett through his analysis, which suggested that the apparent disparities in housing applications could be explained by purely economic factors. His presentation was polished, filled with complex charts and economic theories that seemed designed to overwhelm the jury with technical details. In my professional opinion, Dr. Barrett concluded, there is no statistical evidence of discriminatory practices. The patterns we observe are consistent with standard market forces and risk assessment practices. When it was time for cross-examination, Anthony approached the witness stand with quiet confidence. The gallery leaned forward, wondering how the young lawyer would handle this formidable expert. Dr. Barrett, Anthony began, you've testified in 17 housing discrimination cases over the past decade, is that correct? Yes, that's approximately right, Barrett replied. And in all 17 cases, you've testified on behalf of property developers or large corporations? I testify based on my analysis, regardless of who hires me, Barrett answered defensively. Anthony nodded, then displayed a document on the courtroom screen. I have here your peer-reviewed paper from 2015, where you wrote, and I quote, housing markets naturally segregate based on economic factors, and attempts to force integration through legal means often backfire. The expert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That was an academic discussion of economic theory, not a comment on any specific case. Yet you've used the same argument in each of your 17 testimonies, despite varying circumstances and evidence. In fact, Anthony continued, pulling up another document, in the Johnston case last year, you used identical language to dismiss statistical evidence of discrimination, even though the mathematical model was completely different. For the next hour, Anthony methodically dismantled Dr. Barrett's testimony, not through emotional arguments, but through careful analysis and documentation. He demonstrated how the expert had consistently ignored contrary evidence and modified his analytical methods to support his predetermined conclusions. During the afternoon break, Judge Henderson overheard two law professors discussing Anthony's cross-examination. He didn't just challenge the testimony, one said admiringly. He exposed the entire industry of professional experts who help corporations disguise discrimination behind economic jargon. The defense team's frustration became increasingly visible as their star witness's credibility crumbled under Anthony's questioning. The senior partner from New York repeatedly objected, but each objection was calmly addressed with relevant legal precedent that Anthony could cite from memory. A powerful moment came when Anthony displayed two maps side by side, one showing the rejected applications, and another showing redlining practices from the 1960s. Dr. Barrett, can you explain why your purely economic factors perfectly match historically discriminatory boundaries? The expert's attempted explanation grew increasingly tangled, and his previously confident demeanor began to crack. The gallery watched in amazement as Anthony used the expert's own data to support the case for discrimination. Late in the afternoon, an unexpected development occurred when a group of current employees from the development company requested to speak with the judge in chambers. They had been following the case and wanted to come forward with additional information about discriminatory practices they had witnessed. Judge Henderson, who had once dismissed Anthony based on his appearance, now found himself repeatedly ruling in the young lawyer's favor as the defense made increasingly desperate attempts to exclude this new evidence. The judge's transformation from skeptic to admirer was visible to everyone in the courtroom. A touching moment occurred and an elderly resident from the affected neighborhood stood up during a break in proceedings. She had been quietly watching the trial all week, and now she approached Anthony with tears in her eyes. My grandson wants to be a lawyer, she said, her voice trembling. He's been watching you on the news every night. You're showing him that it's possible to fight for justice and win, no matter what obstacles you face. The day concluded with Anthony presenting a series of internal company emails that directly contradicted Dr. Barrett's testimony. The experts' carefully constructed economic justifications fell apart in the face of candid discussions about maintaining neighborhood demographics and preserving community character. As the courtroom emptied for the day, Judge Henderson remained at his bench, reviewing his notes. He couldn't help but reflect on how his own biases had almost prevented this crucial case from receiving a fair hearing. The young lawyer he had initially dismissed had turned out to be one of the most skilled advocates he had ever seen. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of law students had gathered, hoping to catch a glimpse of Anthony. Among them was a young woman who had almost dropped out of law school after facing discrimination herself. "Watching you this week," she told him, "has given me the courage to continue." The media coverage had evolved from focusing on the novelty of a young lawyer standing up to a judge to examining the deeper implications of the case. News analysts were discussing how the trial was exposing not just one company's practices, but an entire system of hidden discrimination in the housing market. As the trial entered its fifth day, the atmosphere in courtroom 304 was charged with anticipation. The defense team arrived early, huddled in intense discussion. Their client, the CEO of the development company, was present for the first time since the trial began, his presence suggesting the growing stakes of the case. The morning began with an unexpected motion from the defense. They were requesting a dismissal based on technicalities in how some of the evidence had been collected. Anthony had anticipated this move. It was a classic last-ditch effort when the facts weren't on your side. "Your Honor," Anthony addressed the court, his voice steady and confident, "the defense's motion ignores established precedent." He proceeded to cite 3 recent Supreme Court cases that directly addressed similar situations, his command of the law drawing admiring glances from the law students packed into the gallery. Judge Henderson, who had spent the evening reviewing the case law, nodded appreciatively at Anthony's thorough response. "Motion denied," he declared, his tone carrying none of the condescension that had marked his first interaction with the young lawyer. The defense's next strategy became clear as they called a series of witnesses who had been approved for housing in the disputed properties. Each testified about the fair treatment they had received, attempting to counter the narrative of discrimination. During cross-examination, Anthony demonstrated remarkable skill in maintaining his professional demeanor while exposing the careful selection process behind these witnesses. Through gentle but precise questioning, he revealed that each success story actually reinforced the pattern of discrimination. "Ma'am," he asked one witness, "you mentioned you were approved immediately. Could you tell the court your previous address?" The answer revealed that all the approved applicants came from the same few preferred neighborhoods, inadvertently supporting the plaintiff's case. During the lunch break, a senior partner from one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms approached Anthony. "We've been watching your performance this week," she said. "Your combination of technical expertise and genuine commitment to justice is rare. We'd love to discuss your future plans when this is over." Anthony thanked her politely, but his mind was already focused on the afternoon session. He knew the defense was saving their strongest counter-arguments for the final hours, and he needed to stay sharp. The afternoon brought a dramatic moment and the defense called a former employee who claimed the company's policies were based purely on financial considerations. However, Anthony's preparation proved invaluable once again. He produced emails showing the witness had expressed concerns about discriminatory practices to HR just months before leaving the company. "Could you explain the discrepancy between your testimony today and these written statements?" Anthony asked, his tone respectful but firm. The witness's credibility crumbled as he struggled to explain the contradiction. The gallery watched in rapt attention as Anthony methodically dismantled each of the defense's arguments. His approach wasn't flashy or aggressive. Instead, he relied on careful preparation, clear logic, and an unwavering focus on the facts. A powerful moment came when Anthony called a rebuttal witness, a young professional who had attempted to rent from the development company. Despite having excellent credit and income that exceeded their requirements, his application had been repeatedly lost or misplaced. "I have an MBA from Northwestern," the witness testified. "I make 6 figures. But somehow, my application kept disappearing until I used my friend's address from a different neighborhood. Suddenly, everything went smoothly." The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive, suggesting the witness was biased. Anthony remained calm, letting the facts speak for themselves. When he redirected, he simply asked the witness to show the court his document trail, 27 emails trying to follow up on his original application. Late in the afternoon, the CEO of the development company requested to address the court. His legal team looked nervous as he took the stand, clearly deviating from their planned strategy. He began by defending his company's practices, but under Anthony's careful questioning, his testimony began to unravel. "Sir," Anthony asked, displaying a series of internal memos, "could you explain why your company's rejection rate for qualified applicants is 300% higher in certain neighborhoods, even when controlling for all economic factors?" The CEO's response was defensive and evasive, marking a sharp contrast to the clear, fact-based presentation Anthony had maintained throughout the trial. Several jurors were seen taking detailed notes during this exchange. As the day drew to a close, a local community organizer stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor," she called out, "there are hundreds of people outside who have been affected by these practices. They're hoping to submit their stories as additional evidence." Judge Henderson had to restore order as murmurs swept through the courtroom. While he couldn't accept new evidence at this stage, the moment highlighted how the case had grown beyond a simple lawsuit to become a catalyst for community action. The day's proceedings concluded with both sides preparing for closing arguments. The defense team looked defeated, their initial confidence replaced by grim resignation. Their star witnesses had been discredited, their evidence had been turned against them, and their legal arguments had been systematically dismantled. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around community members sharing their own housing discrimination stories. The case had opened a floodgate, encouraging others to come forward with similar experiences across the city. Back in courtroom 304, Anthony stayed late, reviewing his notes for the next day's closing arguments. Judge Henderson, preparing to leave, paused to watch the young lawyer work. The contrast between his initial prejudgment and the reality of Anthony's capabilities weighed heavily on his mind. A young law clerk, cleaning up for the day, overheard Anthony practicing part of his closing argument. The words echoed through the empty courtroom, "This case is about more than housing policies or statistical patterns. It's about dignity. It's about justice. It's about whether we truly believe in equal protection under the law." The morning of closing arguments dawned with an electric atmosphere. The line to enter the courthouse stretched around the block, as people from all walks of life hoped to witness the conclusion of a case that had captured the city's imagination. Inside courtroom 304, every seat was filled, with law students sitting cross-legged in the aisles and reporters crowded at the back. The defense team went first, their closing argument reflecting a strategic shift. Gone was their initial dismissive attitude, replaced by a more measured approach that acknowledged the community's concerns while still denying any systematic discrimination. "Ladies and gentlemen," the senior partner began, "we've heard emotional testimony and seen complex statistics. But emotions aren't evidence, and statistics can be interpreted many ways. What we haven't seen is direct proof of discrimination." As the defense spoke, Anthony sat quietly at his table, occasionally making notes but mostly listening intently. The transformation from the young man whom Judge Henderson had initially dismissed was striking, his presence now commanded respect from everyone in the courtroom. When it was Anthony's turn to deliver his closing argument, he rose slowly and approached the jury. Instead of going straight to his prepared remarks, he paused for a moment, looking at each juror in turn. "When I first took this case," he began, his voice clear and measured, "someone asked me why I chose to fight this particular battle. Why not take an easier case? Why challenge one of the city's most powerful development companies? The courtroom was absolutely silent as he continued. The answer is sitting right here in this courtroom. It's in the faces of the people who've been told they're not good enough, not welcome enough, not right enough for certain neighborhoods. It's in the stories we've heard of families pushed out of communities they've called home for generations. Anthony then methodically walked through the evidence, but he did it in a way that wove together both the human stories and the statistical proof. He displayed a series of photographs, empty storefronts where family businesses had once thrived, elderly residents forced to leave their longtime homes, young families denied the chance to build their lives in thriving neighborhoods. The defense claims we haven't shown direct proof of discrimination, he said, turning to face the defense table. But what we've shown is something more powerful, a pattern so clear, so consistent, and so damaging that it can't be explained away by coincidence or economics. He proceeded to display a timeline that connected the company's internal communications with their rejection patterns. When they wrote about maintaining neighborhood character on January 15, rejections in certain zip codes spiked 200% the following week. When they discussed community standards in March, qualified applicants from minority neighborhoods suddenly faced new, unprecedented requirements. The defense attorney attempted to object, but Judge Henderson shook his head. Everything Anthony presented had been properly entered into evidence, he was simply connecting the dots in a way that made the pattern undeniable. As his closing argument continued, Anthony did something unexpected. He acknowledged the complexity of the situation. Change isn't easy, he said. Development and progress will always bring challenges. But those challenges must be faced with fairness, transparency, and respect for all members of our community. In the gallery, several elderly residents who had testified earlier in the trial wiped tears from their eyes. They had spent years trying to prove what they knew was happening, and now they were watching as their experiences were finally being validated in a court of law. Anthony's voice grew stronger as he approached his conclusion. The defense wants you to believe that this is just about business decisions. But when those decisions consistently push certain people out of certain neighborhoods, when they consistently deny opportunities to qualified applicants based on where they come from, when they consistently reinforce patterns of segregation that our society has fought for generations to overcome, that's not business. That's discrimination. He turned to face the jury one final time. Your verdict in this case won't just affect the plaintiffs. It will send a message about what kind of city we want to be. A city where your zip code determines your opportunities, or a city where everyone gets a fair chance. A city that preserves inequality under the guise of property values, or a city that believes in justice for all its residents. As Anthony returned to his seat, the courtroom remained silent for several moments. Even the defense team seemed moved by the power of his arguments. Judge Henderson, who had watched the young lawyer transform from someone he had prejudged to someone he deeply respected, had to clear his throat several times before calling for the defense's rebuttal. The defense's final response felt hollow in comparison. Their arguments about property rights and market forces seemed to fall flat against the weight of evidence and humanity that Anthony had presented. Before dismissing the jury to begin their deliberations, Judge Henderson did something unusual. He addressed the courtroom directly. Over my years on the bench, he began, his voice carrying unexpected emotion, I've learned that justice sometimes comes from unexpected places. It requires us to look past our preconceptions and listen to the truth, no matter who speaks it. The jury filed out to begin their deliberations, but the impact of the case was already evident. Law students were furiously taking notes, community organizers were making plans for similar cases in other neighborhoods, and reporters were rushing to file their stories about a young lawyer who had transformed a housing discrimination case into a powerful statement about justice and dignity. As the courtroom began to empty, an elderly janitor who had been quietly watching the proceedings all week approached Anthony. "Young man," he said softly, "I've been working in this courthouse for 40 years. I've seen thousands of lawyers come and go. But I've never seen anyone speak truth to power quite like you did today." Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. People held signs reading, "Housing Justice Now," and "Equal Rights, Equal Housing." What had started as a single lawsuit had become a movement, inspiring similar cases across the country. Back in his chambers, Judge Henderson sat at his desk, reflecting on his own journey through the trial. The young man he had initially dismissed based on appearance and age had delivered one of the most compelling arguments for justice he had ever witnessed. It was a powerful reminder that wisdom and excellence can come in many forms, and that true justice requires us to look past our biases to see the truth. The jury's deliberations lasted 3 days, though it felt like an eternity to those waiting for the verdict. During this time, the case's impact continued to ripple through the city. Community organizations held workshops explaining housing rights, law schools organized special seminars on housing discrimination, and local politicians began drafting new housing oversight legislation. Anthony spent these days meeting with community members, helping them understand their rights and the broader implications of the case. He worked from a makeshift office in a community center, surrounded by stacks of housing applications and newspaper clippings about the trial. On the morning of the verdict, the courthouse was packed beyond capacity. The hallways were filled with people watching the proceedings on hastily installed monitors, and a large crowd gathered outside, listening to live updates on their phones. When the jury filed back into courtroom 304, the tension was palpable. The forewoman, a retired school teacher, handed the verdict to the court officer, who delivered it to Judge Henderson. The judge took a moment to review the document, his expression giving nothing away. In the matter of South Side Community Alliance versus Metropolitan Development Corporation, Judge Henderson began, his voice steady, "The jury has reached a unanimous verdict." The courtroom fell completely silent as he read the decision. The jury had found overwhelming evidence of systematic housing discrimination. They awarded the plaintiffs not only the requested damages but also imposed significant punitive damages to deter similar practices in the future. But the monetary award was just the beginning. The verdict included requirements for comprehensive policy changes, independent oversight of housing applications, mandatory fair housing training for all employees, and regular audits of acceptance and rejection patterns. As the verdict was read, Anthony remained composed, though his eyes shone with emotion. The community members in the gallery hugged each other, some crying quietly. The defense team sat in stunned silence, while their client, the development company's CEO, quickly left the courtroom through a side door. Judge Henderson then did something unprecedented. He asked to make a personal statement before concluding the proceedings. "When this trial began," he said, removing his reading glasses, "I made an assumption about a young lawyer based on his age and appearance. I nearly allowed my prejudices to dismiss what turned out to be one of the most significant civil rights cases this court has seen. The irony of my bias in a discrimination case is not lost on me." He paused, looking directly at Anthony. "Mr. Richardson has taught this court, and indeed this city, a valuable lesson. Justice doesn't have an age. It doesn't have a look. It simply has truth, and the courage to speak that truth." The impact of the verdict was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours, other development companies across the city began reviewing their housing policies. Civil rights organizations reported a surge in people coming forward with similar cases. Law firms that had initially overlooked Anthony were now competing to partner with him. But perhaps the most significant change was happening at the community level. People who had long accepted housing discrimination as an unchangeable fact of life began to see the possibility of fighting back. The verdict had given them not just hope, but a practical roadmap for seeking justice. A week after the verdict, Anthony organized a community meeting in the South Side neighborhood at the heart of the case. The small community center was overflowing with people, residents, activists, lawyers, and even some former employees of the development company who had come forward during the trial. "This verdict isn't the end," Anthony told the gathered crowd. "It's a beginning. We've shown that the system can work, but only if we're willing to stand up and demand that it does. He then announced the creation of a housing justice clinic, staffed by volunteer lawyers and law students, to help other communities fight similar battles. The case began to have national implications. Law schools across the country added it to their civil rights curriculum. Housing rights organizations used it as a template for similar lawsuits in other cities. State legislators began drafting bills to strengthen housing discrimination protections. A month after the verdict, Judge Henderson spoke at a judicial conference about the importance of confronting unconscious bias in the legal system. He used his own initial treatment of Anthony as an example, earning him a standing ovation and sparking important conversations within the legal community. The development company, facing both the verdict's requirements and public pressure, underwent significant changes. They hired a diverse executive board, implemented strict anti-discrimination policies, and established a community advisory council to review their housing practices. Anthony's success attracted attention from major civil rights organizations and law firms, but he chose a different path. He established his own practice focusing on housing discrimination cases, working with a team of young lawyers who shared his passion for justice. His firm became known for taking on difficult cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. 1 year after the verdict, Anthony returned to courtroom 304 for another housing discrimination case. This time, when he entered, Judge Henderson stood up, a sign of respect rarely shown to attorneys by judges. The gallery was filled with law students and young lawyers, all hoping to learn from the young man who had changed the face of housing justice in their city. As Anthony prepared to present his opening statement, he glanced at a small photograph he kept in his briefcase. It showed the community celebration after the verdict, with elderly residents hugging young families, children playing in the streets, and people of all backgrounds coming together. It reminded him why he had chosen this path. The legacy of the case continued to grow. Documentary filmmakers created a feature about the trial and its impact on housing rights. Civil rights organizations cited it in their advocacy work. Law schools used transcripts of Anthony's arguments to teach future lawyers about effective advocacy. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was visible in the small changes: families moving into neighborhoods they had once been denied access to, community businesses reopening, elderly residents able to stay in their homes, and young professionals finding housing without facing discrimination. The case had started with a judge's prejudice against a young lawyer, but it ended by changing how an entire city thought about justice. It proved that real change was possible when courage, preparation, and truth came together in the pursuit of justice. As Anthony rose to address the court in his new case, he carried with him not just the weight of his previous victory, but the hopes of countless others who were still fighting for their right to fair housing. The young lawyer who had once been dismissed had become a symbol of something much larger: the power of standing up for what's right, regardless of the odds.